This morning's public hearing on the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Our first testifier is Mr. Caleb Rossiter, PhD, Executive Director from the CO2 Coalition, and traveled from the D.C. area, I believe, to be with us today. Thank you, sir, for joining us, and you can begin when you're ready, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Metcalf. In balancing energy needs and environmental protection, not just quality of life, but lives themselves are in the balance, whichever way you lean. So before leaning, it's important to know why. I'm a former professor of statistics, mathematics, and public policy at American University. I direct an alliance of 55 climate scientists and energy economists called the CO2 Coalition. I'm happy to report that when I retire in January, I'll be replaced by a talented Pennsylvanian, geologist Gregory Wrightstone. Mark Twain famously identified three descending gradations of falsehood: lies, damn lies, and statistics. Analyzing the magical claims by the Department of Environmental Protection about RGGI, I'd like to add models to that list. As a professor, I taught not just statistics and mathematical modeling, but also their use in cost-benefit analysis for public policy. We must include all the costs, not just all the benefits, to find the net effect of a policy decision like RGGI, and DEP does not. Statistics and modeling are often combined into one technique, which we broadly call multiple regression or econometrics. It controls for all variables so you can see the independent effect of each one. But DEP dispenses with this technique and provides you with a lawyer's one-sided brief rather than an accountant's fair analysis. It uses input-output models that can't distinguish between correlation and causation. A proper analysis would conclude that RGGI is an act of economic, health, and environmental suicide. It will raise electricity prices, increase health problems and mortality, and damage the environment. And it won't even affect the level of the dreaded, but actually beneficial, CO2 emissions. First, a look at the science. The lead picture on the DEP website for RGGI, contradicting all the peer-reviewed science and the UN body that studies climate change, shows emergency workers surveying a flooded town. I can't believe that we are 15 years since Al Gore stood and tried to convince the world that Hurricane Katrina came from SUVs and not the normal flow of events, and we're looking at a picture like this to justify your policy. As a professor, I taught my students about the Latin enemies of logic. This one is called post hoc ergo propter hoc. Correlation is causation. CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere have increased due to industrial emissions. We have a flood. The increase must be the cause of the flood. But weather is not climate change. The UN reports no statistically significant change in rates of extreme weather, including floods, in the era when CO2 emissions were large enough to cause measurable warming. We are not in a CO2-driven climate crisis. That is the scientific fact. Some models predict we may be in one in 100 years, but even their estimated damages pale next to the fossil-fueled increase in wealth we will have on hand to address them. And remember, there are benefits to CO2 emissions, since the molecule is a crucial plant and plankton food. Now to economics. RGGI is not a market-based approach, as claimed by DEP. We already have an energy market, and the result is that over 80% of American energy comes from fossil fuels. Why? Because they are inexpensive, reliable, and efficient. RGGI is a market-distorting approach. It taxes fossil fuels even more than the $50 billion they're already net taxed. It subsidizes so-called renewable sources of energy. There is nothing renewable about renewable energy. The sun and wind are indeed free and recurring, but turning their energy into electricity is fossil fuel intensive. Minerals for blades, panels, and batteries have to be mined in horrific conditions in Africa, powered by fossil fuels. They have to be refined, transported to America, manufactured and erected on platforms requiring massive amounts of concrete, another major source of CO2 emissions. Then come the lengthy transmission lines that bring the power to populated areas. And you still have to back up the intermittent electricity with fossil fuel plants. DEP says Economic modeling shows that participating in RGGI will lead to a net increase of more than 27,000 jobs and add $1.9 billion to the gross state product in Pennsylvania. Huh? You're going to raise the cost of energy dramatically, reduce reliable fuels in favor of intermittent ones, and that's going to increase jobs and productivity? How's that working out for California this week? Renewable electricity, once subsidies are factored in, costs 4 times as much per kilowatt hour as natural gas electricity. When states are mandated to provide renewable energy, the result is blackouts, misery, and reduced economic activity. Now, how did DEP do its magical thinking? Through the Regional Economic Models Incorporated, or REMI, input-output model. Input-output models change a single parameter, in this case the addition of the money taken from electricity providers in RGGI auctions, and then estimate the economic impact as it cascades through the economy. Sure, spending that money creates jobs and growth. But remember, that same amount of money is also removed from the economy as the effective tax is passed along to consumers of the electricity. So its impact on growth and jobs is immediately canceled out. RGGI estimates incorrectly count only benefits and not costs, and even ignore the harm to the competitiveness of your industries of raising the cost of energy inputs. Now let's turn to the model health claims. DEP models health benefits from RGGI's reduction not in CO2, carbon dioxide, but in coal-fired pollutants like sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, and particulate matter. DEP estimates that up to 639 premature deaths will be avoided by 2030 because of Pennsylvania's participation in RGGI. But that will mostly be due not to RGGI policy, but rather fracking's dramatic reduction in the price of natural gas electricity that will reduce coal-fired power. Affordable heating saves far more lives than coal-fired electricity loses. A 2019 study for the National Institutes of Health estimated that 11,000 lives are saved in America each year by fracking. When costs are low, more people use enough heat to stay healthy. DEP's failure to do a full cost-benefit mortality analysis for a policy change, or even in this case, a production change due to other factors, is inexcusable. The same goes for the claimed 30,000 less hospital visits from asthma from ground-based ozone, which is a byproduct of fossil fuels. DEP did not factor in increased hospitalization for deadly pneumonia and bronchitis from more expensive heating. In addition, the NOx, the nitrogen oxide that creates ozone, which then stimulates asthma, can be successfully scrubbed to low levels with modern coal power technology. This coal cleaning technology is in operation in America only at the Turk plant in Arkansas, because it was the only one under construction when the natural gas revolution exploded. A retrofit with this technology would be a lot cheaper than RGGI hamstringing the economy, which has its own health impacts. Finally, let's take DEP's environmental claims. As you reduce emissions from coal and natural gas, you have to compensate with wind, solar, hydro, or nuclear. But the construction of dams, say in your Pine Creek Gorge, or wind turbines, say throughout your state's game lands, would indeed have tremendous environmental costs. And while the solar-powered grid electricity you would use comes from states that are thousands of miles away, as Americans, we can't just ignore the environmental costs there. As Johnny Cash used to sing about trucking, there ain't no easy run when it comes to providing Pennsylvanians with affordable, reliable energy. There will always be trade-offs. Governor Wolf justified his RGGI order by dramatically claiming that average temperatures in Pennsylvania, as is the case globally, has increased 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit in the past 110 years. But that global increase began with an entirely natural warming after the Little Ice Age ended in the 18th century. Half of the increase came from 1920 to 1950, before CO2 levels were large enough to cause measurable warming. The UN climate body is only confident of all that warming that more than half of the more recent half of total warming, from 1980 to today, came from industrial CO2. Pretending that all the warming for 110 years was human-caused is misleading. A quarter is more likely, according to the UN. Please finally note that RGGI errs scientifically in including methane in the warming gases it controls. I have with me today for the committee a recent study called Methane and Climate by 2 leading atmospheric physicists in our coalition. Methane emissions are only 1/10 as powerful in forcing as carbon dioxide. Each molecule is 30 times more potent, true, but we only have 1/300th the level of methane emissions that we do of carbon dioxide emissions. It's a very minor product and warming gas in total. So it's 1/10 as important as CO2, and CO2 is about 1 degree for a doubling, which takes hundreds of years. Cows and pipelines can rest easy in Pennsylvania. I look forward to hearing your perspectives and taking your questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir, for your testimony. And just to remind the members as we talk with our testifiers today, they're here to present their expertise, and they're not here to be engaged in an argument. We can argue amongst each other at a later time, and we will, I'm sure. But they are here for us to gather information from. So please refrain from engaging the guests in an argumentative fashion and stick to a questioning to solicit information that you're looking for. Members that have questions? Representative James?
Could you put me on the list?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony. I'm over here. I might move for the next one. You mentioned California, and it is, of course, very timely. It's in the news. The fires are raging out of control, et cetera. Can you give us a little bit more background on how they find themselves in this dilemma, please?
Yes, sir. California has the legislation in effect that, and other incentives for the companies that are presaged by the RGGI regime here. For at least a decade, California has forced its energy companies to purchase renewable power from other states primarily, which is much more expensive, and they haven't allowed the prices to rise. The costs have risen, but the price does not, and so that's absorbed by the company. They've dramatically reduced their ability to spend on the proper clearance for their power lines and for providing the fossil fuel and nuclear fuel they do. So, for example, in California, if cars are running on oil, that oil is sometimes brought from Saudi Arabia, which no one else in America even does because of restrictions on them having their own fossil-fueled plants to produce oil and refine it there. Wildfires, of course, are a very predictable scientific fact in California and will always be there for a variety of reasons, mostly not related to temperature, but to management and forest density, things of that nature. So California's got a double whammy now. They've got these terrible fires after the COVID has harmed their economy, but their energy grid cannot handle it. So like South Africa or Egypt, places I study in Africa, they're now putting out brownouts and blackouts to maintain the grid, which is inexcusable in a developed country with all the resources that we have.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Lee James. Representative Vitale.
Thank you. I first just want to apologize for my conduct last hearing. I lost my temper, and that's not who I want to be as a chairman. So just get that on the record. If I could, sir, thank you for coming. Let me just read you a statement. You had mentioned the United Nations, and let me read you a statement from the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which you know is a body composed of some of the world's best atmospheric scientists. And it's actually two different statements made at two different times. And one is their report with regard to climate change. And the quote is this: "One of the key messages that comes out very strongly from this report is that we are already seeing the consequences of a 1% Celsius, a 1 degree Celsius of global warming through more extreme weather, rising sea levels, diminishing Arctic ice, among other changes." And then in 218 they said, "Staying at or below 1.5 degrees Celsius requires slashing global greenhouse gas emissions 45% below 2010 levels by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050. Now, I mean, is it safe to say, reading the material on the CO2 coalition, that you disagree with that?
On those two statements, sir, let me take the second one first. I think there is some good argument in the second one that there is an impact, as we know, and we agree with the UN, of CO2 on temperature. And trying to stay under a 1.5 degree increase since 1900, you probably would have to slash. However, the first question is more important, which is what's the effects of that warming? Now, as I said, the UN says in the body of its report that only a quarter of the 1 degree Celsius rise, which is about 1.8 Fahrenheit rise since 1900, can be attributed confidently to CO2. So most of that warming change, the climate change they're talking about, comes just naturally and came before the CO2 era in 1950. But the other important point she raises, how is it that the studies in the report and the body of the report show clearly that the slope, the rate of change of sea level from 1920 to 1950, before the carbon dioxide era, is the same as the rate today, about a foot a century? It's a long natural claim. So for them to put in sea level in their press release or in their summary, executive summary, they frequently contradict in their language of press release and executive summary what's in the body of their report. In my testimony, I have the footnote for the sea level rise being the same today as it was before CO2 was an impact, which is very well known. It's a long-standing problem for the people in the Netherlands, for example. Since 1800, sea level has been coming up, which of course is long before CO2 is a factor.
But what they are saying in essence is that we need to reach carbon neutrality by 2050 to avoid the worst effects of climate change. We have to slash our greenhouse gases to avoid very serious consequences. Do you agree with that conclusion?
I agree that that is their model predictions that you can see in there.
Now, do you agree with that conclusion?
Well, it's a matter of opinion. It's very hard to look forward.
What is your opinion?
I'm trying to give it, sir.
Waiting.
As you look forward, you have to use a climate model to get to the year 2050. And climate models is something that I teach and I love and I'm very interested in, but they're very uncertain. They're not oracles. They're tools. So with certain assumptions about the sensitivity of climate's reaction to carbon dioxide, you could have serious problems. So this is a prospective problem. The models are key to it. I don't think that the models should be the basis, and I've testified for this before the Congress, for making such an important policy decision to forego these future damages that are modeled versus real damage today by raising the price of energy. I don't.
So do you believe climate change is real and we ought to be reacting in a very deliberative way to combat it?
By climate change, you mean change in temperature driven by carbon dioxide? Or do you just mean the fact that
I mean the
climate
conventional definition.
No.
Please.
Oh, no,
Please.
It's very important. As a professor, I always say we better know what we're talking about. Climate has changed about 1 degree
I'm
since...
using it in the conventional sense, sir. Please.
What is the conventional sense, sir?
You're dancing.
No, I'm not at all. I'm trying to act professorially and say, are we talking about natural climate change in the last 100 years? And about 75% of temperature has been natural, according to the UN, and a quarter has been CO2-based. If it's CO2-based, you have to look at the data today. We don't see, the UN doesn't see any statistically significant change, whatever the cause of this warming, in the number of hurricanes per decade since 1920, before the era, the rate of sea level rise since 1920. So I would affirm the UN's data, because I can't create the data. The data don't show any more tornadoes per decade, hurricanes per decade, flooding per decade. That's the UN talking.
Okay, one final question. So, well, actually, RGGI, in effect, when it goes into operation, essentially causes less coal to be produced, more gas to be produced, and have nuclear power, existing nuclear, maintain itself. Now, you said this will result in more air pollution. Now, if you are shutting down coal, which I think we can agree is very dirty from a conventional air pollution source, increasing gas, which testifiers will say is cleaner than coal, and maintaining nuclear, which is essentially emission-free, how is it, one, that this will not result in greenhouse gas being reduced because coal emits less greenhouse gas than natural gas, and two, air pollution won't be reduced because coal is dirtier. I don't understand why reducing coal, increasing natural gas, and maintaining nuclear doesn't result in less CO2 and less conventional air pollution.
Thank you, sir. I testified that it will damage the environment, and it won't even affect the level of CO2 emissions because of the solar and wind power which will be added to your mix. And I testified that solar and wind are not renewable. They take tremendous amounts of fossil fuel to be burned. Carbon dioxide and other pollutants enter the atmosphere stream, whether they're burned in Canada, here, or Africa. You will have this tremendous damage of mining, transporting, refining, and then trying to recycle all these wind turbines and solar panels, and especially the batteries. The batteries haven't yet solved the problem of storing the power overnight, and we hope that it will. So what you're doing is increasing the solar and wind, which is a tremendous environmental impact, not on the atmosphere, but in general impact on the land and the mining of it. And then you are not going to reduce fossil fuel use anyway, because you're going to have to get your power somewhere, maybe from a coal plant somewhere else. You will have natural gas reduced under RGGI more than it would be otherwise. Yes, under RGGI, natural gas is going to rise, but it would rise much more. The natural gas producers also have to take part in the auction because they emit some carbon dioxide.
Okay, if I could just...
President Vitale, we're going to be out of time for this witness. We have two other...
Could I just have one more question, sir?
No, you've already said that was your last question, but thank you. President Dush.
Thank you, Chairman. Professor, it's great to have you here. I really appreciate your answers. And, you know, you touched on something that in going through thousands of pages, things like the non-governmental international panel on climate change. There's thousands of pages of summaries of studies. And you kind of touched on this, but there's a thing in computer science called garbage in, garbage out. Same thing goes with statistics. I want to go back, since the previous questioner said something about coal being dirty. Coal, natural gas, oil, they all come from the same thing, compost. It's the composted plant material that were here centuries ago. Leaving something out like the medieval warming period, as Professor Mann did in his study, those types of things, which are a lot of the flaws that you see in these other studies, how would anybody, the academic vigor that goes into these things, would people be able to actually get through their doctoral thesis defending that on some of these studies that you've...
You're referring to studies that look back at the temperature record to the year 1000, which I don't even look at too much because it's so difficult to get the input data for that. Tree rings and coral shells are pretty hard to correlate with precise temperature. However, it's a modeling exercise. That's a backwards modeling exercise. There's also future modeling exercises, the ones we've just discussed, that look to the year 2050 or the year 2100. In all of them, and I've taught them and I adore them, but changing one or two assumptions can completely change your answer from positive to negative on any of these. They're supposed to really help you look, if this were true, what would happen? If this were true, what would happen? But they can't say what would be true. The father of the models had a wonderful line. This is John von Neumann, who was our great mathematician in the Defense Department after World War II. He actually wanted the climate models to work because he wanted to figure out the atmosphere so he could cause drought in the Soviet Union as a weapon. Fortunately, he failed. He didn't, but he was playing with them. And he famously said, when he invented these mathematical models that they use now, the global climate models, if you give me 4 parameters free, I can draw an elephant. If you give me 5, I can make it wiggle its trunk. And just last year, a couple mathematicians did, in fact, put out a paper showing that with 4 parameters, you can draw an elephant with the resulting output line and make the trunk wiggle. The models are useful for what they are, but as we've learned through COVID, the models can't help you if you get some of your assumptions right. And it's very hard, and I don't have anybody's, not calling anybody's motivations out, it's very hard to predict the future, as they say. Because if you slightly change one parameter in a 1,000-parameter model, and you have to estimate most of those parameters, models are just not a good tool for deciding what the temperature will be in the year 2050. And then there's that link between temperature and hurricanes, sea level rise, flood, ice. All of these are complex physical processes. So there's no defining truth in a model, but it can help you make estimates. That's about it. You have to decide in the present what would be better, to retrofit your coal plants, like the Turk plant down in Arkansas, so it removes most of the pollutants, that cost versus the benefit to the health of people, or get rid of the coal plants and start buying a lot of this solar and wind, as California did, and raise your prices. There are results to that, too.
Thank you, Representative Dush. Representative Rapp for our final question.
Thank you, sir, for being here today. It was very informative. Currently, from what I understand, solar and wind provide about 1% to the grid as far as electricity goes.
Here in Pennsylvania. I'm sorry.
That's some of the hearings, I think,
Okay.
and it
I'm
could
not
be
sure.
a little bit more, today. So when we're looking at solar and we're looking at turbines, and people who are supportive of RGGI are also usually promoting green space, all of that. But isn't that going to take away, if they're looking to actually contribute a whole lot more to the grid,
Right.
there's going to have to be a whole lot of land mass set aside on our hilltops for turbines and solar fields. So being a mathematician, any projections on how much land mass it would take to bring that 1% up to even 50?
Paul Dreesen has done work on this with the actual mathematics. I think it was you'd have to move everybody out of all the New England states, New York and Pennsylvania, and just put wind turbines there. But unfortunately, that's missing the point. Even with the wind turbines there, providing that, you would need a massive amount of batteries to store the power, and technology's not there yet. And so what do? What California does, what you do right now. You have to have the reliable energy that can be turned on in a heartbeat, nuclear, hydro, gas, or coal. And so the places that have done a lot of wind and solar, which is phenomenally expensive and uses a lot of fossil fuels anyway to construct it, they have to maintain their natural gas and coal-powered plants, their hydro, their nuclear, because you need that power, or the grid, as you'll hear from more experts than me today in this testimony, will shut down and you won't be able to function. So you don't even replace. You have to have that other power because it's intermittent. When the sun is not coming through and the wind is not blowing, you still need to have the power to make sure the lights are on, your hospitals are open, people are working. It would be wonderful if the battery technology got there. But it seems to have stalled in the last 15 years to make any major contribution. Storing power overnight is a very tough technical problem, apparently.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.